One of the more childish and sneaky angles of attack against men's rights activism involves trying to shame us as time wasters and do-nothing whiners for engaging in public advocacy and debate over gender issues in response to feminist public claims. This really ramps up when we discuss issues affecting male victims of female-perpetrated intimate partner and sexual violence, especially when discussing factors contributing to their adverse help-seeking experiences. As soon as the contribution of feminist dogma and political pressure is brought up, feminists and industry devotees come out of the woodwork to try to figure out a way to stop that discussion. They feign ignorance of the history of social and legal response to female victims and the issues facing anyone wanting to mobilize and administer similar resources for men. They respond to discussion of these issues by questioning in a dramatically oversimplified manner why the individual they're targeting hasn't simply achieved a solution to the complaint. Their standard? MRAs must solve the problem without any of the support feminists claim is essential to their work, and without addressing any of its causes or tearing down any barriers in the way of resource acquisition or idea implementation. HBR Talk with Hannah Wallen. The same people who whine that there's never enough money being given to women's organizations to address these issues, who rely on government handouts to fund their work and legislation to facilitate their goals, demand that you, the individual lone MRA, who may be buried under the very issues you're discussing on social media, shut up and single-handedly solve them. They'll bend over backward to deny the issues men face while trying to redirect to women's issues and victim narratives. They'll demonize men as a way of implying that men in adverse circumstances are undeserving of help, and they'll blame men for their own circumstances of disadvantage using an ugly sexist stereotype of masculinity that only exists in the minds of feminists and in boys raised in environments created by the implementation of feminist ideas. We're supposed to believe they're really so stupid that they don't know they're suggesting the impossible from individual advocates and demanding that you justify having not magically achieved what they have never even tried to do, and have in fact actively tried to hinder. We're not supposed to notice their influence on the very system we're complaining about. We're not supposed to know that domestic violence victim shelters weren't started by feminists, nor did feminists fund their creation themselves. They stole the idea and the project of community activist Erin Pitsey, dropped the part where she was also working with abused men, expanded the idea of shelters for women into an industry, and lobbied the governments of their respective nations to foot the bill. Of course, we're not supposed to know Erin either. Are feminists really that stupid, or is this their version of an alternate reality game? Maybe one in which their history of informing law and policy is unknown to their critics. In the U.S., the first law that passed to provide funding for family violence shelters was gender neutral. The Family Violence Prevention and Services Act of 1984 also funded a national 24-hour hotline and established guidelines for law enforcement to communicate that various forms of criminal violence didn't become something to ignore when they were committed between family members in the home. Unsatisfied, U.S. feminists lobbied for another 10 years until they got the Gender-Specific and Discriminatory Violence Against Women Act, which added feminist dogma to training of officials at every level of the justice system and made it legal for shelters to discriminate against help-seeking men. After years of men's activists complaining about said discrimination, a non-discrimination clause was added to the act. The feminists who run victim services came up with ways to get out of providing men equal service anyway. If they didn't just ignore the law altogether, using the presumption of malice and danger from men as an excuse to deny them service, they funneled male help seekers into perpetrator programs no matter what kind of abuse complaints they had. The feminists who work in these organizations will try to counter MRA's public complaints with the claim that these shelters serve male victims. But how exactly is it helpful to deny them an equal means of escaping their abusers, or to accuse them of abusing their abusers? These harridans will go on to suggest the individual take on alone the task of starting the kind of agencies for which feminists receive government funding and organizational support. They'll claim that if he continues to debunk their anti-male rhetoric on social media, he really doesn't care about men, as if the lies they spread aren't a contributing factor to the challenges faced by anyone trying to start any kind of services for men. Where would one go for the funding that would be needed, as well as licensing and approval for the existence of any organization needed to run a project that would provide those services? Feminists needed someone else to come up with the idea for them, then had to have a wide network of community support as well as government funding to replicate what she did and maintain it. That would be the feminist-influenced government, which, because of their direct efforts, now has extensive standards and policy based on feminism's male-demonizing beliefs. In the U.S., it has proven to be impossible to even get our federal government to acknowledge, when gathering statistics to inform law and policy addressing these issues, that severe forms of intimate partner and sexual violence are the same crimes when perpetrated by women as they are when perpetrated against women. When men do create services for male victims independently of feminism, feminists harass them for it, fight to deny them any funding, and demonize their efforts as an attack on female victims. They condemn activists who provide any support services for men independently of feminist dogma as hate organizations and try to get them shut down. Then, whether the attack is successful or not, they demand to know why MRAs, including those who are male survivors of abuse trying to recover from life-wrecking circumstances, aren't doing the things men's rights groups actually do. Meanwhile, our feminist critics continue to use our nation's governments as forums for, and enforcers of, bald-faced, spiteful lies about the nature, characteristics, and behavior of ordinary men, to the detriment of men's welfare, and for their own financial gain. This, you'll be told, is all justified by one underlying issue. Women are oppressed because men are dominant. They cite adverse conditions that affect both sexes as evidence of women's oppression, then cite women's oppression as the reason why these conditions affect women much more severely than they affect men. This, they claim, justifies citing those conditions as evidence that women are oppressed. You're not supposed to recognize that this is circular reasoning, leaving the oppression claim entirely unsupported. That way they can accuse you of being part of a giant conspiracy against women. Then they can dismiss the impact of abuse in your life as negligible in comparison to women's experiences, and that's why they're comfortable arguing for a right to gatekeep the very concept of abuse victims' services in order to exclude you. If you object to being so maliciously slandered, their response will be to tell you to shut up about it, or they'll add allegations of callousness toward the targets you're defending from their slander to their list of false allegations against you. You're supposed to believe the gatekeeping and mudflinging will end, or at least that you won't be grievously affected by it if you just stop complaining about it. It's as if they think you're as stupid as they're pretending to be. This week, Deborah Pawnee joins HBR Talk to discuss how feminists use slanderous narratives about men to influence government policy on responses to coercive control, and the role of feminists' attempts to gatekeep public discussion about intimate partner violence. The discussion streams on multiple platforms. You can tune in to the live stream via the link in the low bar, or find other viewing and listening options on HoneyBadgerBrigade.com.